Thank you all very much for coming to this session today. Good afternoon. My name is Tabia Campbell-Fowley, and I'm an independent conflict research and programming advisor based in Berlin, Germany. And today I have the privilege of moderating the session. Peace support and how peace processes, how Track 2 contributes to trust building and cooperation through environmental dialogue. I'll just mention a few housekeeping points before we start. The session is being recorded and it will be made available by the conference organizers, and translation is also available. There's a QR code, so please do use it if you want to. I'd also like to really encourage you to think of this as quite an interactive session, a bit more of a conversation than sort of us talking at you. So we will be opening the floor, partway through today, and we really hope that, there's a dynamic conversation that develops between all of us here in the room. I'll just start us off with a little bit of framing, a little bit of background for the session, and then introduce our distinguished panel. I have to say that I came into this a little bit later, as unfortunately the original moderator of the session, Albert Martinez, was not able to join us here in Ottawa, but he has walked me through kind of the background, the genesis, and thinking as to the conversation that we're going to be having today. So I'll do my best to represent that. So really where this comes from is kind of an acknowledgement that over the past decade, perhaps 15 years, formal Track 1 peace processes seem to have lost quite a bit of the sort of momentum that we might have seen, more like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, in a lot of contexts in the world. And instead, Track 2 work has really been able to quietly, in many contexts, advance real progress, including in spaces where political actors can come together and discuss critical issues facing communities, like resource sharing, like environmental challenges. So the thinking behind today's panel is really this: how can we understand this role of Track 2 processes in a future where perhaps Track 1 is increasingly more challenged, for many different reasons. And so what we're going to be doing here is actually drawing on direct on-the-ground experience by all of our panelists. You'll hear, less of the sort of theory-based conversations and really a lot more about what's working, what our panelists have been observing and doing in the different contexts that they work, and also perhaps what has kind of surprised them about the way that their work is unfolding. So this is a real opportunity to hear from practitioners today and people who are really immersed in the peace building world right now. So with that, I will introduce our panelists, starting with Nazanin. So Nazanin Moshiri works for the Berghoff Foundation, leading efforts to integrate climate considerations across the conflict transformation and peace building work that the organization does, including in dialogue and mediation initiatives at national and regional levels. And before joining the Berghoff Foundation, Nazanin was a senior climate, environment, and conflict analyst at the International Crisis Group. She led on research and reporting, as well as media contributions on how to best respond to climate environment-related risks in conflict zones. Nazanin has worked for 2 decades as a journalist, including roles at Reuters, Independent Television News, and Al Jazeera English. She has also served as an expert on the United Nations panel of experts on Somalia. Next, we have Hisham Omaisi with the European Institute of Peace. Hisham is an information specialist and a conflict analyst by profession, and currently the senior Yemen advisor with the EIP. He's previously worked as the Information Resources Center Director and with the U.S. mission to Yemen, where he received the U.S. State Department's Superior Honor Award. He has over 20 years of experience working with government and non-government organizations and is a regular speaker in conflict and human rights conferences and conventions, and a media commentator with bylines in the press, reports, and documentaries on Yemen and the region. And he holds a BA in International Relations and an MA in Reconciliation and Peace Building and a master's degree in Conflict, Peace, and Security. And then we have Lena Hillard from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. She is working on environmental peace building at HD, which is a Geneva-based private diplomacy organization. Her work focuses on supporting the management and expansion of the organization's global environmental peacemaking portfolio. And prior to joining HD, Lena worked on human rights, EU foreign policy, and environmental issues in Geneva and Brussels. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from the Geneva Graduate Institute, and a BA in European Studies from Maastricht University. So thank you very much to our distinguished panel for being here. And with that, I will jump in with our first round of discussion. So let's kind of start by zooming out a bit. So those who are working on peace building issues on the ground have really, as I mentioned, kind of seen a broader shift in the last several years, with kind of the reduction of effectiveness in many track one processes, stalling in many places, perhaps a recurrence of conflict that, where it's really tough to kind of see that cycle broken. And meanwhile, track two efforts increasingly perhaps able to open conversations that official actors may not be able to access anymore. So this kind of feels like it's a major part of the bigger kind of set of gears moving in the world right now. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask each of our panelists for a short 2 minutes, let's say, assessment of how you see the role of the peacemaking specifically in this moment of kind of rising geopolitical contest and armed conflict. And perhaps we'll start with Nazanin.
I've thought deeply about this question. I think it's a great question. These are really turbulent, very, very difficult times for all of us right now. We are investing in missiles rather than mediators. It's the reality that we all have to face. And I guess we need to stop assuming that track one processes are going to arrive, because in many places they're stalled, they're fragmented, and frankly absent. That's a reality that a lot of people are facing. And for the communities experiencing those conflicts, they are living through these everyday pressures. They're living through pressures, they need water, they need livelihoods, they need ways to prevent disputes escalating. And that is where environmental peace building comes in. And that's where the value of environmental peace building comes in. So look, in Iraq, people don't wake up every day thinking about climate security or climate peace and security or environmental peace building. That's not what people are thinking about. They're trying to survive increasingly hotter summers and then flooding in other parts of the country. What these shared pressures, I guess, create at a track two level is something that's really increasingly rare in conflict settings, which is that kind of common problem, that shared common problem. And in some cases, we found it is a lower risk entry point for cooperation because you're not asking people to sign a political agreement. Of course, politics is at the heart of everything that we do, but you're not directly saying, hey, let's sign this political agreement. What you're doing is you're trying to solve these practical problems that everyone's sort of facing. So I'm not saying that it replaces the track one. It cannot replace a track one. You still need to push on, the infrastructure. You need to push on getting track one processes going. But it can build trust. It can create those habits of building relationships, right? And it can help societies maintain the capacity to cooperate when the formal politics are failing them. And I think that's the key.
I don't know what to add to that. I'm just going to echo what she said, especially the part that it cannot substitute political negotiations or conflict resolution for that matter. It can be a complementary track. But beyond that as well, now this is one of the things that we've noticed when we did work in Yemen, also in Somalia, is that parties have created these psychological barriers against each other. They wouldn't even talk to each other. Down a bit of an off-ramp using the environmental peacemaking will come to the table. It's easier for them to talk to each other discussing water than power sharing or military withdrawal or basically land movement. And through the technical cooperation, just to make it too technical political, it created that trust building measure. They would meet regularly, they would talk to each other. We saw a softness of approach. First meeting, of course, was a little bit turbulent, but then we saw a softness of approach and then gradually started to open doors for other discussions that are otherwise very sensitive. So there's a lot of potential there. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are still dismiss it as something superficial or something, oh, who's going to be talking about the environment when their bombs are dropping? But the people on the ground actually do care about the environment because it impacts other parts of their lives, their water system, their waste management systems, their land, the pastures, the fishing ponds. So there's a domino effect there that impacts the people on the ground, and it creates a humanitarian crisis that again then invites the whole world to their own. We need to pay more attention to this, and it becomes of a bargaining chip of sorts for the political powers to leverage against each other. So dialing back from that, it's got a lot of potential. It can be used, as Nazanin said, as a good entry point, but it will not yet substitute formal political negotiations or conflict resolution mechanisms.
Lena.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's quite clear so that we face a new conflict landscape and really challenges to traditional peacemaking. And I mean, as all of you have mentioned, I think it's true that there are lots of like track one processes that are stalling, that are struggling to deliver comprehensive agreements. But I think it's also important to realize that there are also at the moment quite many track one efforts ongoing that are really focusing more on sort of short-term fragmented transactional deals. And I think that's also really like one of the challenges that you have like major powers that are brokering agreements that really focus more maybe on like a broad framework, but then they actually leave a lot of issues like unresolved. And I would say that this is also an angle, like an opportunity where track two actors can come in, because there's really sort of the need for creative approaches that, address some of the issues that have been left unresolved, and maybe also to provide some clarity on who does what, when, supporting sustained engagement and dialogue. And so I really do think sort of track two actors in general have like a lot to offer there in terms of like creative ideas, and environmental peacemaking in particular, because I think it's a field that has like, lots of sort of different approaches and insights, I think also as Nazanin and Hisham mentioned. And I would say that specifically for us at HD, we have seen through our work in Asia that really using sort of informal dialogue platforms at the track 2, but also at the track 1.5 level, and then focusing on climate and environmental issues can really sort of effectively complement and contribute to formal diplomatic relations or initiatives, and not necessarily sort of only in situations of conflict, but really like in context where you have like very tense interstate relations, you have like deep-seated mistrust between states, and also then sort of broader geopolitical dynamics that constrain cooperation. And I think sort of, there's a lot of value in these informal dialogue platforms. And I mean, I don't want to go into detail now, but I'll talk a little bit more about it like throughout the session on sort of, how this complementing can look like, and like what type of results it can produce.
Thank you. Yeah, you've really foreshadowed my next question perfectly, which was essentially an invitation for you all to sort of dive a little bit deeper and get a little bit more concrete, because we really want to use this opportunity to hear from you about what you're seeing is happening on the ground, what works in practice in these track 2 spaces, what doesn't, as I mentioned before in my introduction, perhaps what surprises you. And kind of keeping in mind, I guess, the framing of this panel, which was, track 2 projects operating in spaces where track 1 may be stalled, may not exist at all, may be complementary to ongoing track 1 processes. So I'll ask each of you a question and an invitation to kind of perhaps bring up a little bit more from your practical work. You've already mentioned some of the regions you're working, but happy to hear more detail about that. And perhaps I'll ask you to keep your interventions to about 5 minutes. Perhaps we'll start with Lena. Could you share a bit more about how natural resource governance has served as an entry point for dialogue, You obviously work in contexts including Nigeria and the Bay of Bengal. So if you could kind of describe for us these informal negotiation spaces that you just mentioned, and the programs that have helped create these kinds of spaces for engagement.
Thank you. Maybe just for a bit of context, so HD mediates really in some of the world's most violent conflicts, but then also, as I mentioned earlier, increasingly in situations of tense sort of interstate relations and where you have really sort of conflict escalation risks. And so there it's really also about like seeing like, I mean, we have the climate environmental issues that are exacerbating, I would say, also conflict risks or escalation risks. And so we're also increasingly mediating at that level from an environmental peacemaking perspective. So it's really sort of ranging from the track 3 local level in places like Nigeria, more towards like 1.5, 2 level across Asia. And I actually thought that maybe also today with like the topic on sort of track 2 actors like complementing track 1 process, I want to talk a little bit more about actually the work in Asia and sort of share key insights from our experience in 2 regions, in the South China Sea and in the Bay of Bengal. And I mean, yeah, I think, as you know, sort of in both regions, the work I would say is more sort of about conflict prevention, mitigation, and sort of preventing really sort of escalation rather than resolution. And sort of obviously you don't have like formal track 1 processes or like peace processes, but I mean, there are also track 1 initiatives ongoing to address escalation risks. And in general, yeah, you have like very tense security environments and geopolitical dynamics. And the first insight that I wanted to share from our work is that we have really seen that using science as the basis for engagement can really result in collaboration that has sort of a bit like these twofold outcomes. So on the one hand, it can really further environmental protection, and on the other hand, it can also contribute to confidence building between the states. And there I wanted to share a little bit more about what we have done in the South China Sea. I mean, yeah, as you know, like very like tense geopolitical environment where you also have lots of escalations at sea between the different claimant states. And I sort of at the track 1 level, I mean, you have also a process by ASEAN and by China sort of on having a code of conduct that would also sort of guide behavior also by maritime law enforcement navies to reduce escalation risk at sea. But this has been like a very long sort of process, and the code of conduct is still not signed. And I mean, we have sort of also engaged with this track 1 level or like track 1 process, but what we have also been thinking about is, okay, how can we actually find like other points for like trust building between the states? And so what HD has been doing is that since 2018, we have convened policymakers from China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam to really focus on the topic of like sustainable fisheries management in the South China Sea and how you can prevent a collapse of fish stocks. And that was really sort of a topic that resonated with all the countries, and also where there was a realization that no country can address this on its own, and that the decline in fish stocks is also actually fueling some of the risks and conflict dynamics. I think sort of since the 1950s, more than 70% of the fish stock has declined in the South China Sea or has been depleted. And so there are also really risks to like food security, livelihoods, and it really resonated with states. And so what we have sort of been doing is to look at it more from like a very like scientific or technical angle. So really grounding it in scientific evidence and then having technical experts at the discussions, which helped also to depoliticize it to a certain extent and also manage to promote cooperation despite, like, as I mentioned, a very tense geopolitical environment. And some results that we have seen is that, for instance, scientists from the 5 countries, they have worked together on shared fish stock assessments. And I mean, they have focused, I think, on one species in one of them, so quite niche. I think it was like skipjack tuna. And what was quite special about it is that sort of they all use the same methodology to like conduct this assessment, and then they shared the data. And I mean, data sharing is like very, very sensitive. So it was quite a big step. And I think it also addresses the element that there is also a lack of reliable data in the region. And so it was really sort of the scientific angle that enabled the cooperation. And now the experts have actually set up a fishery science working group, and that's basically sort of a standing mechanism for dialogue, for data sharing, for joint analysis. And of course, sort of the main objective is to address this topic of sustainable fisheries management. But I think it's also a channel of like communication, of cooperation in a tense environment, and sort of has this trust building element. It's very important to highlight. Then maybe to like share a similar example, but slightly different, is that I think in general, like one insight from us, from our work in Asia, was that informal dialogue platforms can really sort of create a space for engaging on difficult issues for states and for regional institutions that can then result in regional cooperation that is hopefully sustainable. And there I wanted to talk a little bit about our work in the Bay of Bengal, where, I mean, the context is maybe to some extent similar than the South China Sea, but I mean, a lot less tense at the moment. And there we are running sort of this like track 1.5 dialogue platform, where we're also bringing together scientists, policymakers, experts from the different countries, from the littoral states. And yeah, talking about like issues like ranging from like marine security to maritime environmental governance, also, topics like illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So really sort of topics that concern the whole bay, and really provide a space also to have like frank conversations and to create a shared understanding of the challenges affecting the region, and then getting to like collaborative initiatives together. And I guess maybe what makes this informal platform like unique or complement formal initiatives, at least also from what we heard from participants in their feedback, is that, I mean, it's really looking at the Bay like in a like more holistic sense, and is not constrained by institutional mandates. So you have all the littoral states engaged, also Myanmar, for instance. And that then, I mean, you have like really a neutral facilitator, and you also have like the different actors, so scientists, but then also we have like Coast Guard, Navy representatives, different policy makers who are participating. And so I think it's also maybe a combination of actors that sometimes doesn't meet in necessarily sort of the track one spaces or the regional institutions. And what you see there is that, I mean, the dialogue platform in itself has really allowed states to agree on like different issues and collaborate on different issues, including, for instance, sort of shared norms for engagement by maritime law enforcement agencies, a regional sort of fishery, or not fisheries, but more marine science network that has been set up, and also a framework for like sort of disaster management in the region. And I think what's interesting about all of these is that they're anchored in, or like kind of connected to, regional institutions. And I think that's also because sort of the platform brought in as well the regional institutions, so not only the states, and then try to identify ways in which you can anchor the outcomes in the regional institutions, so that hopefully they're sustainable, and maybe also don't depend necessarily like for the entire future on like a facilitated dialogue platform. And so yeah, I thought like these are maybe 2 points that I wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a really good point to kind of to mention as well, thinking about the future sustainability and whether there's an external actor who's kind of responsible for continuing that conversation, and is that the most productive approach we could imagine. I do also want to come to your point on data sharing, and kind of where there's a lack of kind of reliable data that you can bring people around together. I think that's such an interesting point, and potentially a good way to transition to Hisham. And maybe you can kind of talk us through the work that you've been doing in Yemen, and the political dialogue that EIP has built after this really large scale local consultation process, and kind of information gathering, and kind of a way to start building a conversation where the situation has been really intractable previously. So maybe you could kind of talk to us about that journey, and maybe particularly highlight how environmental work kind of came into this process, and what we can kind of draw out of that.
Definitely. The conflict in Yemen has been going on for quite a while now. But the one thing we kind of noticed with the UN coming in, regional players coming in, they were talking to a specific set of people, let's call them the usual suspects, and which is usually upper echelon of the political kind of pyramid. And I've been part of the meetings that these people were attending, and there was this massive disconnect between what's being discussed in those circles and the various pockets of political factions within Yemen, including the population at large. And this is where the EIP stepped in. They wanted to help Yemenis themselves, and also the international community, better understand what were the immediate needs of Yemenis, not just the political echelon. And we conducted that massive survey. And as you can imagine, in a conflict zone, doing surveys is dangerous enough. But in a place where researchers get picked up, kidnapped, thrown in a dungeon is even more risky. And but we worked with local researchers. We talked to about 16,000 people, the initial phase, across 9 governorates, and in places where the bombs were still falling. And at the time, I believe it still is the biggest survey that was conducted. And I remember attending one of the conferences just last year at the BCSC, and people were like, we surveyed and we talked to 300 people. And I came on stage and I was like, in the first phase, we talked to 16,000 people, then 3,000 people, then another 7,000 people. And everybody was like, what? Wow. So it was actually quite massive. We didn't really realize it at the time. But one of the things that came out of those surveys, of the consultations, is that the willingness of the people to speak. A lot of people were happy. They're like, finally, somebody's talking to us. We're not completely marginalized. We're not invisible, because they thought they were invisible to the political forces. But one of the things that came out of that survey, much to our surprise, was when we asked the question, what are the top 3 priorities? And as you can imagine, in a place where it's going to war, first thing is, please end the conflict. Second is reparations. Third, rebuild those bridges. But 2 or 3, in a lot of places, priorities, second and third priorities were, please protect the environment. We really worry about the environment. And as you can imagine, this is a place in the Middle East, in Yemen, and you're like, seriously? Environment? They're like, yes. But a bit of a context, 70% of Yemen is rural. And to a lot of people's surprises, they do worry about the environment. They monitor climate change in their own way. So it's not us only here in the West to believe that, oh, this is a phenomenon that we should be taking care of. This is recent. The science is recent. No, these are the people up the hills who have been doing this, not just the native Indians. They've been doing this and they've been monitoring this and they've been developing their own strategies on the ground for hundreds of years. But so we decided to do a second survey and a third survey to dig deeper into this. What are the problems? What are your concerns? And it turned out to be some serious issues there, from scarcity of water, from erosion of soil. There's like the environmental issues that are like massive. But then we wanted to bring this to the table, especially at a time when, as we mentioned earlier, where track 1 negotiations were stalling. Issues are quite sensitive that are being discussed. And we're like, okay, how about we try talking about the environment? And parties were receptive. They're like, okay, this is one thing. I can convince my superiors, but I'm meeting with the other side about something that is less contentious. It's about the environment. And they did, and they showed up to the meetings, the first meeting, the second meeting, the third meeting. And after several meetings, they're being nice to each other. It's kind of nice, honestly, because, again, as I mentioned earlier, there were like really serious psychological barriers, and especially with the intractable conflict that has been going on for over a decade. And there's been a lot of demonization during that period, so they don't want to talk to each other. They're sitting next to each other. It was a true trust-building measure. And they started working towards solutions. They started developing, for instance, at one point, we started to draft a water governance roadmap. And fortunately, there was another bout of conflicts, and you can't control these kind of things. This was in late December, and then you've all seen what happened in the region with Iran, things like that. These kind of conflicts tend to derail these efforts, but they do not beat them. The trick is to sustain it, go back to it, and build on what already exists, revive some of those efforts. And again, I know we've seen that we've already talked about this a couple of times already. Measure your expectations, and it will never replace track 1, but it could contribute to track 1 negotiations. One of the things that we talked about over the past year, especially when we talk about the water governance roadmap, is that this could actually feed into a peace roadmap, a national peace roadmap. It could be one of the main components, and it could be one of the things that it could be used as a stepping stone. Because sometimes when you reach these peace agreements, they're like, the ask is way high, the bar is way too high. There's no point to discuss or meet in a room together. But this kind of roadmap offers an opportunity for them to come to the room. And then once they're in the room to discuss this, you can build on it and add components to it towards a national roadmap. This is other issues, especially when issues like water, when issues like waste management, when issues like soil erosion basically has a domino effect in creating more conflicts. And again, in the local community, they don't really care about the power sharing. They don't really care about the military deadlock. They care about is that, am I going to have clean water? Am I going to have a parcel of land where I can plant my seeds safely without worrying about landmines? Is the soil safe? Because there's been a lot of cluster munitions that have been used in Yemen, and so on and so forth. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and more. So thank you, Isham. Thanks. I think those points that you mentioned in particular also about the role and potential of Track 2 to be at a much more community engagement level, and also to really take that incremental trust building kind of role really seriously. That's really interesting. And that's what I would love to hear more from Nazanin on as well. And if you could kind of speak to your work in Iraq or, other contexts as well, but I know Iraq has been a really key focus area of your work on this, and sort of how you've approached this community engagement question. And perhaps if you also have some thoughts on kind of where the limits are and where we need to then think about kind of the next steps and transitioning Track 2 into 1.5 and into 1.
Sure. So just first of all, it's not a coincidence we're all sitting here together. We're actually part of a project called the Weathering Risk Consortium, which is funded by the German Foreign Office. And so we're kind of working in different countries, but we're all sort of working towards, I guess, the same aim, but in different kind of contexts. It's very context specific. So for Berkov, under this consortium, we've been working in Iraq and in Somalia. And you've been working in Yemen and Nigeria. Yeah, just to explain why we're all sitting here together. So Iraq is a great example. In Somalia, we also have some fantastic projects, but I'm going to focus for Iraq for the sake of time. So we work with, we have a country office in Iraq. We work with partners called Peace Paradigm. And look, Iraq currently, I think it's the only country in that region that's been attacked by both sides. So it's had bombings which have been carried out by the US, but also it's been attacked by Iran as well. So it's right in the thick of things right now in terms of the conflict and the current conflict in the Middle East. And it's experiencing this at a time of really deep issues around water scarcity, increasing temperatures. One person I know in Baghdad just described to me living through a summer in Baghdad. The atmosphere, the air is like, it feels like it's crackling, it's so hot. So one of the projects that we worked on was in an area called Balad, which is about, I think, 90 kilometers north of Baghdad, which has all kinds of issues related to water scarcity, related to sort of tribal issues there, related to land allocation, etc. So, what works, what we found works was that we start with the lived realities of people. We listen to them and we create a safe and inclusive place. And we're not the only ones to do this. We're all in this room have conducted Track 2 processes like this, but just want to get to this example because I think it's a really good one. So we didn't arrive in Balad and tell the communities how to solve the conflict. It was a long process. It took about 7 months, where we would ask them to start with their shared realities and their shared challenges. And to cut a long story short, basically, by the end of the process, what was decided by the community and something we helped them with was a water user association in Balad, the largest in Iraq. So we found that one of the core issues there is water allocation. How is water used? Who gets it? Who doesn't? And this water user association works because it's related to action. So it's connected directly to action. So there's a database, there are tools, there's a method to it, and it's not informal, it's connected to the Ministry of Water as well. So there's a sort of formal element to it as well. And so it's brought the community together. People are actually able to now access water when they weren't able to before. And what's great is that other parts of Iraq have heard about this water users association, and now they want the same thing. So 3 or 4 different towns, including Fallujah, have come to us and Peace Paradigm. They want us to recreate this water association in other parts of the country. So for me, that really worked because it was connected to action, something tangible, something that we were able to provide. One example, perhaps, where things don't work as well, although they have worked to an extent, but there's a limitation of how far you can go, is in a place called Al Zubayr, which is in Basra. And there are all kinds of issues in Basra over a lot of displaced people, host communities, water issues, conflict issues, you name it. And so we went into Al Zubayr, and again, we tried to create a sort of meaningful dialogue around these issues. We were successful to an extent. There was a social pact in the community. But the problems in that region are just so great with the unemployment, with the lack of services. These are issues that need to be addressed by people who are bigger than us, you know? So, the dialogue needs to be then paired with meaningful infrastructure projects. So repairing canals, improving irrigation, creating opportunities for young people. If you don't do that, then yes, we have a social pact, that's all good and well, but where's it going to go if you don't actually then follow that up? And that's where the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus comes in, where we have to work together to help the community. What I've been really surprised by, and this is not just in Iraq, but in other contexts, including Somalia, is how sophisticated local systems are and how communities already have the mechanisms, you know? They're already mediating, cooperating on a daily basis, right? So we're not introducing something new here, and I think we need to be really emphasizing that. So what we're doing is just connecting communities and strengthening those systems that have been weakened, especially in the context of Iraq, by years of underinvestment, years of conflict that date back to the US invasion in Iraq and all the other issues that have gone on in Iraq. I think those are some good examples of sort of what worked and what is now being replicated, and what perhaps, where we are limited in the work that we can do, because we are peace builders, right? We're not large development organizations. We can't do that work that's needed.
Thanks, Nazanin. I think that's a really good point to kind of emphasize again, is that this has to be a joined up kind of effort if we want to, or if we expect there to be kind of an effective outcome. And I'm sure that's not something that I need to emphasize to the room here, but it's certainly, I think, a really important point for us to continue, coming back to this point and advocating for less siloed, more joined up and connected kind of nexus thinking and approaches. So I think we'll just kind of have another quick round of interventions from our panelists, maybe thinking a little bit more about kind of, okay, now you've sort of talked us through what the work is that you're doing and kind of where this fits in with the local conditions and context, but maybe you can kind of talk to us a little bit about what you think the lessons are that are coming out from the work that you're doing, and how we might be able to, pull this into a higher level of thinking and contribute a bit more to the wider kind of environmental peace building sort of space and thinking beyond specific geographies, regions, things like that. So I think maybe then let's start with Hisham. Maybe if I could just ask you to Talk to me about where you potentially see the biggest risks of track two actors potentially overreaching in a process, potentially being instrumentalized by parties that they're trying to engage. Where would you highlight those risks and maybe any lessons for others who are kind of operating in that track two space based on the projects that you've mentioned?
Okay. I mince my words.
This is being recorded.
Yes. Well, track two organization do a lot of good. The thing is, no EIB, I'm talking about just generally speaking, is that they risk being used by government or political factions to advance their own agendas. I'm sure you've heard stories about organizations working in the region, globally, elsewhere, where some are used to gather intelligence. Some, and this is when you go to operate to these places, the first thing they tell you, like, why are you here? Are you here to extract information? And this doesn't come out of nowhere. It's because some other people did actually do that. Some other organizations did actually do that. And capital organizations, I'm talking about the risks now, just focusing on the risks. Organizations or donors can use them to weaponize resources. I've seen organizations come and do water management, but then the political factions that brought them in, they use that data, they use that information, or that mediation for that matter, to hoard the water and weaponize it, use it as a bargaining chip against the other faction in a certain specific region. A lot of these organizations, and I've seen this happen in Yemen as well, where they blur the line between facilitation and advocacy. As suddenly, gradually, they start adopting the lines of a certain faction when they were supposed to be completely neutral and facilitator rather than standing with one side and advocating for a certain point of view. There's another risk as well. And another risk is these track organizations basically start thinking they're track one. And that's a huge problem. But suddenly you go into these international venues and then you see the organization competing with the government, with the political faction, and then you have to contend with that organization. You're arguing with that organization as opposed to arguing with the political factions that are actually fighting. You're like, dude, calm down. This is not your fight. You're here facilitating for an indigenous people. That's it. But we're just talking, I think Asaf is here, right there in the back. From the previous session, we're talking about the tendency for overpromising. Some of these track two organizations, this is a major risk where they come in and they're like, talk to us, we will help you, and we'll bring your issue to the international scene, and we'll provide you with a solution. No, you won't. You can't. You're a track two organization. You overpromise, you leave, and you don't deliver. Guess what happens when the next organization goes in there? Nobody will talk to them. Even if they're serious, even if they have the tools, even if they can deliver promises, nobody at the local level will talk to them because the local level will have developed that mistrust. You are extractive, you lied, you must be having a foreign agenda, especially because most of the tracker organizations are international, local. There's a hesitancy to even engage with those kind of organizations. So you burned that bridge. And we also, track two organizations have tendency or potential to become tools of conflict management rather than resolution. Track organizations are there, they want the project, they want funding for 3 years. So, and I've seen this happen where they go in and they're like, you could resolve this in 6 months. They're like, no, we have a mandate for 3 years. Let's jack this a bit because I can hire my friend and a friend of a friend and the network. And we could drag this for 2 years or 3 years. You don't have to. You could just deliver it. You could fix it quickly and leave. Like, no, I want that lucrative 2-year contract. So there's a risk of that. I'm sorry if I'm being nervous. Okay. But I'm just talking about the risks in general. Yeah. And these kind of tracker organizations also sometimes what they do delays formal negotiations because the government will say, I don't need to discuss the national roadmap right now because organization A and B, they're still working on this water thing in TES, and they're going to be done for the next 18 months. So my military campaign might as well continue until they're done with their assessment and their work. So there's always that risk as well of weaponizing those organizations and using them as an excuse. I could go on for a long time about this. But I'll pass on the torch.
Thank you very much, Hisham. And I think that's an invitation to have some sidebars in case the audience is interested to hear some more. But yeah, thank you for that. Perhaps this is a good point to come to Lena, because I think you have some insights about this question of trust building that Hisham mentioned, right? Critical in order for the process to have the highest potential for positive impact, critical for communities to feel like they actually want to and can engage with it. Perhaps you can say a few words on what you have kind of learned through your programs and initiatives about this trust building process.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I mean, yeah, when we were preparing the session, we were also sort of talking from Albert previously about the question sort of how do you build trust sort of without political guarantees. And I think then we had a bit of a discussion that sort of political guarantees, I mean, are not needed for the trust building process. They're more sort of about like agreement implementation, but trust, I think so Nazanin and Hisham have already mentioned it, is like built like incrementally through sustained engagement, through repeated interactions, and then really also through practical cooperation on shared interests. And I think, yeah, it's been also quite clear from the different examples that we have shared that environmental topics, issues can be a useful entry point for trust building and sort of, for promoting or like encouraging cooperation on issues that like appeal to all the parties. I think it's always important to nuance also a little bit, just like environment is a great entry point for trust building narrative, because I think sometimes it's said like, oh yeah, it's always like, I don't know, not sensitive or helpful as an entry point. And I think in some contexts that's true, but in many others it is not. And I mean, in some, I think that also links to a bit like this framing question, because I think in some context, like an environmental topic can be like hugely sensitive. I mean, for instance, if you talk about water resources and water like management, which is maybe like, a shared interest and like a concern. But like, I mean, if you're looking, for instance, at the Mekong, where we're also active, I mean, that's extremely sensitive. And so it might not be sort of that useful of an entry point, or at least not like at the beginning, or it depends a little bit on the stage that you're at, maybe also in terms of engagement. And then, I mean, we have also had the experience actually in like some of our work that like, maybe there's like an environmental topic that seems like it would be like, non-sensitive and might be a useful entry point, appeals to all the parties, but then there was no interest whatsoever in that. And I think for the South China Sea, that was, for instance, like plastics. I think we worked with some like researchers also and who identified this as a major issue, but then in the end, the parties were like, okay. So I think is also really sort of what environmental issues do you then identify maybe as the entry point, especially at like, so the interstate level. I think in some other contexts, also when you're working more at the local level, I think in some cases it's quite obvious, or sort of when environmental issues are also part of the conflict, sort of you kind of have to address them. But I think that's also something to reflect on. And maybe like what our experience has shown is that of sort of for trust to endure, it can be helpful sort of to go beyond these individual relationships. It can be helpful to connect dialogue outcomes with, as I mentioned before, so like regional initiatives, regional institutions, but also national, like subnational, local initiatives, so that you also really have like this kind of sustainability element in mind, and that you also have like trust building engagements that sustained like beyond your sort of dialogue platform. And I think that already means that when you are designing your process, you already need to think about like how do you integrate these actors. And I mean, from like our work in like the Bay of Bengal, in particular, there we have seen that it was like very useful to like bring in like different regional institutions from the beginning, and then see also what maybe initiatives do they already have, what are some gaps, and how can then our ideas maybe, and that the states then are taking forward, be integrated into those ones. Maybe to also talk a little bit more about the local level. I mean, I talked primarily about our work in Asia, in the Bay of Bengal, which is also sort of one of the projects as part of this consortium that we're all part of. And maybe to also talk a little bit about Nigeria, where we're doing a lot of sort of local and focusing on climate sensitive peace agreements. I think they're sort of one way also of like sustaining the trust and making sure also that you have like these continued engagements has been to strengthen also local peace infrastructures as part of the peace process and the peace agreement signing. So seeing like, okay, how can you have like local committees, a peace committee that also involves like the actors that were involved in the dialogue process that also continues to meet regularly. So you have this like sustained engagement and trust building, but also in some cases seeing like how can we maybe also revive some of the traditional structures that were sort of existing already and that sort of maybe need to be strengthened again, but they're already there. So I think it's also really like looking at it from the local perspective. And not necessarily they're sort of the national or state level actors, which we engage with as well. But I think sort of it depends a little bit on the level you're working at. But it is important to kind of think about this like sustained trust element.
Yeah, thanks. And I think emphasizing really that local ownership and kind of the consideration at what point do actors at different levels best get brought in is a really good point. Maybe Nazanin, I'll come to you with sort of a complementary to that. Aside from trust building and all the points that Lena mentioned, what in your view are sort of the other conditions that are necessary for an environmental dialogue specifically to become viable?
So I have worked out there are probably about 4 conditions that are necessary. The first one, you need a shared problem, right? A shared problem that not a single group can solve on their own. So that could be anything from water, land, etc. Number 2, we've spoken about this, local ownership. So you need, you can't impose the solutions externally. It has to come from the community. The third condition that I see in terms of the lessons we've learned is that you need to link dialogue to something visible, something tangible, for it to be worthwhile, And then you need the formal and the informal to be connected. So yes, in areas of Iraq where we work, communities trust tribal leaders more than they do the institutions for obvious reasons. But you can't not involve the institutions if you want long-term sustainable solutions. So those are four conditions. But just a final point, again, I think I just want to emphasize that track 2 cannot replace the reforms we need at a governance level. You can't use environment and climate change as an excuse for poor, corrupt issues and institutions. You also need the infrastructure investment. That's a reality. You need it. And you need the political agenda to continue as well. Track 2 cannot replace that, which I think is really important for us to emphasize.
Yeah, thanks. I think a really good reminder there. And really showing sort of this is the reality of working. This is not a sort of theoretical conversation, but one that's really grounded in those lessons. Thank you all for sharing those.